Victorian dinner parties looked elegant on the surface, but beneath the candlelight was a world of obsession, pressure, and rigid rules. One wrong gesture could ruin your reputation. Today, we're uncovering the shocking things guests were forced to follow at the table, many of which would be unthinkable today. You had to remove your gloves at the table. Every Victorian woman arrived at dinner wearing gloves. This was absolutely non-negotiable. Bare hands in public suggested impropriety, and the journey to a dinner party, even across town in a carriage, counted as public. But here's where the complexity begins. You couldn't actually eat while wearing them. Etiquette manuals were explicit and unwavering on this point. When you sat down at the table, you removed your gloves and placed them carefully in your lap, hidden beneath your napkin, where no one could see them. One guide from the period stated plainly that no well-educated person would eat while wearing gloves. The cultural context here is important to understand. Gloves represented refinement and social standing in Victorian society. Women wore them everywhere outside the home, but eating in gloves suggested you didn't know the difference between outdoor and indoor behavior, which marked you immediately as someone unfamiliar with the rhythms of proper society. You might as well have worn your coat to the table. Men had simpler rules, as they often did. They removed their gloves in the entrance hall upon arrival and never brought them anywhere near the dining room. The positive aspect of this rule was genuinely practical hygiene. Gloves that touched food became stained, greasy, and essentially ruined. Fine kid leather couldn't survive butter sauce. The negative was the elaborate ritual required for compliance. You had to remove them discreetly without drawing attention, hide them properly under the napkin, remember where you'd placed them, and then somehow put them back on underneath the table before rising to leave. One modern etiquette blogger described this process with evident amusement, noting that ladies would subtly replace their gloves under the table as the meal concluded. She exclaimed simply, "Oh, Victorians," when describing this peculiar ritual. But managing your gloves was just the beginning of controlling your physical behavior at the table. What you did with your breath mattered just as much as what you did with your hands. Blowing on hot food was absolutely forbidden. Picture this scene. Your soup arrives, steam rising visibly from the bowl. It's scalding hot, clearly too hot to eat. What do? If you're at a Victorian dinner party, you do absolutely nothing. You wait in patient silence. Blowing on hot food was considered distasteful and immediately revealed a lack of patience and refined sensibility. The Victorians believed firmly that well-bred people could wait calmly for food to reach an appropriate temperature. Blowing suggested you were too eager to eat, which they considered somewhat piggish and common. This applied universally to everything served. Soup, tea, coffee, any dish that arrived too hot for immediate consumption. You set it aside briefly and continued conversation with your dinner companions as if nothing was amiss. Eventually, the food cooled naturally and you could eat at leisure. The cultural reasoning connected to broader Victorian attitudes about class and composure. The upper classes had time. They didn't need to rush through meals like working people who had limited breaks for eating. They could afford to wait for soup to cool. Demonstrating this patience publicly proved you belonged to a class that valued leisure over haste, refinement over urgency. The obvious negative consequence is that this meant frequently eating lukewarm food. Hot dishes arrived hot for good culinary reasons. Soup is best when steaming. Tea loses flavor as it cools. But etiquette trumped temperature every single time. The positive aspect, if you can call it that, was preventing the rather ungraceful sight and sound of people puffing at their plates like bellows. That particular image didn't suit the elegant atmosphere Victorian hosts worked so hard to create. Uncomfortable and impractical, certainly. And if you thought controlling your breath was demanding, wait until you hear what Victorians expected from your entire body throughout the multi-hour meal. You had to sit quietly and maintain perfect posture throughout. Before the meal even began, expectations were already firmly in place. Victorian diners were expected to sit with impeccable posture and listen politely while waiting for food to be served. One etiquette column instructed guests to sit straight, place the napkin properly on the lap, and gracefully listen to companions who would do their best to provide light entertainment until the soup was served and eating could commence. This wasn't merely about looking proper for a moment. It was about demonstrating breeding through sustained physical discipline. Slouching or fidgeting at any point during the evening suggested you weren't accustomed to formal occasions. Proper posture maintained throughout the entire meal, which could easily last 3 or 4 hours, proved you had been raised correctly in a household that valued refinement. The cultural context extended well beyond the dinner table into every aspect of Victorian life. Victorian society policed bodies constantly, particularly women's bodies. Corsets enforced physical rigidity during every waking hour. Posture requirements at dinner simply continued this surveillance into social settings. Your body was never your own. It always represented your family, your class, your moral character. The positive interpretation is that good posture genuinely does aid digestion and creates a more elegant atmosphere for dining. The negative is the exhausting physical demand of maintaining perfect form for hours while simultaneously eating, conversing, navigating complex etiquette rules, and appearing completely relaxed about all of it. Maintaining perfect posture was challenging enough, but the Victorians went even further in their demands for physical control. Even involuntary bodily functions had to be suppressed entirely. Coughing, sneezing, or any bodily noise required immediate exit. Etiquette books were blunt and uncompromising about this particular requirement. Do not spit, sneeze, or cough at the table, period. If you absolutely had to sneeze and could feel it coming, you had 2 options available. Place your finger firmly on your upper lip to suppress the urge entirely, or excuse yourself from the table and leave the room before the sneeze occurred. This rule seems almost impossibly demanding to follow consistently over a long evening. People sneeze. It's an involuntary biological reflex. Cold weather, dust, allergies, illness, any number of factors might trigger a sneeze without warning. But Victorian dining rooms demanded that guests maintain control over even their most basic biological functions. Any audible bodily noise was considered a serious disruption to the carefully maintained atmosphere of refinement and elegance. The cultural reasoning combined practical hygiene concerns with expectations of propriety. Germ theory wasn't fully understood yet in the Victorian period, but people recognized instinctively that expelling air forcefully from your nose or mouth near food was unappetizing for fellow diners. Beyond simple hygiene, any visible loss of physical control suggested a fundamental failure of self-discipline, which reflected poorly on your character and upbringing. The positive aspect is genuinely obvious. Nobody wants someone sneezing directly into the soup course or coughing across the roast beef. The negative is the impossible standard of completely suppressing involuntary bodily functions throughout a multi-hour event. People suffering from seasonal allergies or mild colds faced a genuine dilemma with no good solution. Attending dinner while even slightly unwell meant constant vigilance against any audible symptom that might escape. With so many physical behaviors to monitor, you might think your napkin was simply for wiping your mouth. You'd be completely wrong. It was actually a secret communication system. Your napkin was actually a secret communication device. This rule reveals just how elaborately coded Victorian dining truly was beneath its elegant surface. The napkin wasn't simply a practical tool for wiping your mouth. It functioned as a signaling system with specific meanings attached to its placement at different points during the evening. You unfolded your napkin partially when the hostess did the same. Never before she acted, which would be presumptuous. Tucking it into your collar like a bib was absolutely forbidden under all circumstances, marking you immediately as someone without proper training in refined dining. During the meal itself, you touched the napkin to your lips occasionally to dab away any residue, but never wiped aggressively or visibly scrubbed at your face. Here's where the communication system gets genuinely interesting and complex. At the meal's end, you placed your napkin loosely on the table without any folding. You never refolded it neatly into its original shape, because doing so suggested the napkin was clean enough to be reused at another meal. This implied either that you hadn't actually eaten much, raising questions about why, or that you expected servants to give you previously used linens, which was insulting to your hosts. The napkin also communicated your immediate intentions during the meal. Placing it on your chair when you rose meant you intended to return momentarily, perhaps from the restroom. Placing it on the table meant you were finished with the evening entirely. The positive aspect of this elaborate system is that it allowed silent communication without disrupting conversation or requiring verbal announcements of your plans. The negative is yet another complex layer of rules to remember perfectly while simultaneously eating, conversing with neighbors, monitoring your posture, and appearing completely at ease. If napkin placement seems overly complicated, the rules about where you could sit were even more controlling. Victorians didn't just dictate how you behaved at the table, they dictated who you could sit near. Married couples were deliberately separated at the table. This particular rule consistently shocks modern sensibilities when people first learn about it. Victorian hosts intentionally and systematically seated husbands and wives apart from each other, often placing them at opposite ends of the table, as far apart as the room allowed. One etiquette guide from 1856 explicitly states that husbands should be separated from wives and placed as far from one another as possible so they won't converse among themselves and exclude other guests. The reasoning behind this seemingly cruel arrangement was that marriage was considered a private bond and dinner parties existed for broader social interaction with the wider community. Keeping married couples together at formal events meant they might naturally talk primarily to each other, excluding other guests from conversation and defeating the social purpose of the gathering. Forced separation meant everyone had to engage with people they might not know well, building social connections across the community. This rule extended significantly beyond spouses. Professionals working in the same field were also deliberately separated to prevent exclusive shop talk that would bore other guests unfamiliar with their work. Lawyers couldn't sit with lawyers. Doctors couldn't sit with doctors. Everyone was mixed strategically for maximum social interaction. The positive interpretation is that this arrangement genuinely encouraged diverse conversation and prevented social events from becoming cliquish gatherings of existing friends, ignoring hot newcomers. The negative is the underlying presumption that married people couldn't possibly be trusted to socialize properly if seated anywhere near each other. Modern observers consistently find it curious that even newlyweds face this rule, though some sources suggest the very recently married occasionally received brief exemptions during their honeymoon period. One blogger observed wryly that Victorians structured even love itself around their rigid social expectations. Absolutely nothing in life was exempt from the etiquette book's reach. Separating spouses was just one way Victorians controlled social interaction, but the restrictions on women went far beyond seating arrangements. They extended directly into the wine glass. Ladies were strictly limited to one glass of champagne. This rule sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears, but Victorian etiquette books stated it plainly and without any apparent irony. A lady should never have more than one glass of champagne. One glass, no exceptions, no excuses. 1. The cultural context behind this restriction is straightforward Victorian gender politics applied to alcohol consumption. Women were expected to maintain absolute composure and perfect self-control at all times in public. Any behavior suggesting even mild loss of control, including the gentle relaxation that naturally comes with a second glass of champagne, was considered entirely inappropriate for a respectable woman. One magazine that compiled particularly strange Victorian rules characterized this specific restriction as especially ridiculous, and modern readers tend to agree wholeheartedly. The rule essentially infantilized fully adult women, treating them as fundamentally incapable of managing their own consumption like responsible adults. The positive spin on this rule would frame it as genuine concern for women's well-being and reputation, preventing embarrassing overindulgence in public settings. The negative is the obvious and enormous double standard applied to men and women at the same events. Men faced absolutely no such limitations on their drinking and in fact retired after dinner, specifically to drink port and smoke cigars together, often quite liberally. Women, meanwhile, couldn't even request wine directly from servants. They had to wait passively for a gentleman to notice their empty glass and offer graciously to refill it. One glass of champagne was restrictive enough, but the rule about how women obtained that single glass makes the limitation even more absurd. Women couldn't request wine at all under any circumstances. Building directly on the champagne limitation, this broader rule reveals even deeper gender restrictions governing Victorian dinner behaviour. Victorian etiquette held firmly that ladies should not ask for alcohol under any circumstances whatsoever. Instead, male hosts or dinner escorts were expected to notice attentively when a lady's glass approached empty and refill it without ever being asked directly. One comprehensive etiquette guide from 1883 stated that gentlemen should take upon themselves the office of helping those ladies who sit near them with wine. The responsibility fell entirely on men to be observant. Another source summarized the awkward situation quite bluntly and somewhat sympathetically. Ladies cannot very well ask for wine, yet they do not like to be neglected when gentlemen liberally help themselves. The cultural logic underpinning this rule positioned women as essentially passive recipients of male attention rather than active participants capable of expressing their own preferences. Asking for something as simple and ordinary as a beverage would make a woman appear demanding, forward, or worse, suggest she was overly interested in alcohol, which carried serious implications about her moral character. The positive reading of this rule, if one is feeling extremely generous toward Victorian attitudes, is that it placed responsibility firmly on men to be attentive and thoughtful hosts, anticipating women's needs before they had to ask. The negative is absolutely everything else about the arrangement. Women were rendered completely dependent on the attentiveness and goodwill of whichever men happened to be seated nearby. If the gentlemen around her were inattentive, self-absorbed, or simply oblivious, a lady simply went thirsty throughout the meal. Women weren't the only ones facing exclusion from Victorian dinner parties. An entire category of family members was banned from attending altogether. Children were completely banned from dinner parties. Victorian dinner parties were strictly and exclusively adult affairs. Children were explicitly and repeatedly described in etiquette manuals as entirely out of place at these formal evening events. The guides warned sternly that having little ones present interrupts the genial flow of after-dinner conversation and destroys the sophisticated atmosphere adults work to create. This wasn't primarily about protecting innocent children from exposure to adult topics or inappropriate conversation. It was fundamentally about protecting adults from children's natural unpredictability and energy. Victorian dinner parties were precisely choreographed performances requiring hours of sustained attention to complex rules. Children, being children, might fidget in their seats, speak out of turn, ask uncomfortable questions, knock over glasses, or otherwise disrupt the carefully maintained atmosphere of elegant refinement. The broader cultural context involves the characteristically Victorian separation of domestic spheres. Children belonged properly in the nursery under the supervision of nannies, nurses, and governesses. Adults occupied an entirely separate social world with different rules and expectations. Mixing these carefully divided spheres was considered inappropriate, regardless of the specific occasion. The positive aspect of this strict separation is that adults could genuinely enjoy sophisticated conversation without constant interruption or the need to monitor young behavior. The negative is the rigid division of families, even during social occasions meant for enjoyment. Children rarely saw their parents in formal settings, reinforcing the emotional distance that characterized many Victorian family relationships across classes. Children couldn't attend at all, but adults who did attend faced their own strange requirements before even entering the dining room. The rules began the moment you approached the house. You were expected to arrive exactly 15 minutes late. Here's a rule that directly and completely contradicts everything we assume about modern punctuality expectations. Victorian dinner guests were expected to arrive precisely 15 minutes after the time stated on their invitation. Not early, which was extremely rude. Not exactly on time, which was equally offensive. Not more than 15 minutes late, which disrupted the meal. Exactly 15 minutes after the stated hour. Arriving punctually at the invitation time was considered quite rude and presumptuous. It suggested you were overly eager, perhaps desperate for a free meal, or that you didn't properly understand correct social form. One contemporary source noted that Victorians routinely invited guests for 1 o'clock, fully expecting them to arrive at 2. The writer explained that arriving an hour after the time named would actually be the correct hour to make your proper appearance. This deliberate lateness served practical purposes within the Victorian household. The timing gap gave hosts crucial final preparation moments to ensure everything was perfect before guests arrived. It also ensured that all guests arrived within a predictable small window of time, allowing dinner service to begin promptly once everyone was present. Victorian meals were elaborately timed affairs coordinated with the kitchen. Soup grew cold waiting. Courses were scheduled to follow each other in precise sequence. The kitchen staff operated on strict schedules that couldn't accommodate randomly arriving guests. The positive aspect of this system is that it created absolutely clear expectations once you understood the underlying code. Everyone arrived together within the same quarter hour. There were no awkward early guests standing around watching harried preparations or making small talk with unprepared hosts. The negative is that this essential rule was completely counterintuitive to newcomers. People unfamiliar with upper-class customs would naturally arrive on time and immediately expose their social inexperience before even entering the dining room. Arriving at the correct fashionably late moment got you through the door. But once seated, you faced perhaps the strangest prohibition of all. You couldn't talk about the very thing you'd gathered to share. You were forbidden from discussing or even looking too closely at the food. This rule sounds almost impossibly strange, but Victorian etiquette absolutely and explicitly forbade commenting on the meal in any significant way. Guests couldn't openly discuss what they were eating, couldn't offer specific compliments about particular dishes, and couldn't even examine their food too closely before consuming it. One etiquette guide from 1876 states the prohibition explicitly and sternly: never examine minutely the food before you. You insult your hostess by such a proceeding. Looking too carefully at your plate suggested you were inspecting it for problems, which implied you expected problems, which insulted your host's household. The hostess herself was expected to observe complete silence about her own cooking, leaving guests to appreciate everything without any prompting or fishing for compliments. Modern historians studying Victorian social customs note with some amazement that proper Victorians even banned compliments about the menu. You could indicate enjoyment purely through actions, eating with evident pleasure, accepting second helpings when offered, cleaning your plate thoroughly, but verbal praise beyond the most minimal acknowledgement was considered inappropriate and somewhat vulgar. The reasoning was that excessive enthusiasm suggested surprise that the food was actually good, implying you had expected less from this household. The cultural context involves the carefully invisible labor of domestic servants. The hostess herself hadn't prepared any of the food personally. Her cook and kitchen staff had done all the actual work. Extended discussion about dishes might, as one source delicately phrased it, give servants ideas above their station by publicly crediting their skill. If you couldn't discuss the food, what exactly could you talk about? The answer is surprisingly little. Almost nothing of substance was permitted. Only light conversation was permitted, nothing genuinely interesting. Victorian dinner conversation followed extremely strict and narrow limitations about appropriate topics for polite discussion. Business talk was considered vulgar and inappropriate for mixed company. Politics was deemed far too controversial and might cause genuine disagreement. Religion was too personal and might give offense. One period source states the restriction directly, and quite remarkably, no topic of absorbing interest may be admitted to polite conversation. It might lead to discussion. Consider that extraordinary phrasing carefully. Nothing genuinely interesting was permitted, specifically because it might generate actual substantive discussion with real opinions. The Victorians explicitly preferred shallow pleasantries to genuine intellectual exchange at their dinner tables. The only acceptable topics for safe dinner conversation included weather, upcoming social events, theatrical performances, recently published books of appropriate type, and light gossip about mutual acquaintances that didn't venture into anything too scandalous. Etiquette manuals helpfully published approved lists of suitable safe subjects, essentially cataloguing bland topics unlikely to spark genuine debate or passionate disagreement. Women faced even more restrictive limitations on their conversation than men did. They were expected to be charming and pleasant, but never too intellectual or knowledgeable. Victorian guides warned specifically against excessive displays of learning that might make male guests uncomfortable by suggesting a woman knew more than they did about serious subjects. The positive reading of these restrictions is that they created neutral, conversational ground where people holding very different political or religious views could dine together peacefully without conflict. The negative is that this approach completely emptied dinner parties of genuine human connection or intellectual substance. Everyone performed pleasantness while carefully avoiding anything that might actually matter to them. These conversation restrictions applied throughout dinner, but once the meal ended, the rules shifted dramatically. Women weren't just limited in what they could say, they were removed from the room entirely. Women had to leave the room entirely after dinner. At the conclusion of the meal's final course, the hostess would catch the eye of the senior female guest present and rise from her seat. This was the signal that everyone understood. All women were to leave the dining room immediately without delay, retiring together to the drawing room for tea and light conversation while the men remained at the table. The men stayed behind specifically for port wine and cigars, finally discussing the business and political topics that had been strictly forbidden during the meal itself. This gendered separation lasted typically 30 to 45 minutes before the men finally rejoined the women in the drawing room. The cultural context behind this ritual is overt, institutionalized gender segregation built into every formal social occasion. The Victorians believed firmly that men and women properly occupied fundamentally separate spheres of life, and even shared meals had to conclude with physical separation of the sexes. Women's conversation was considered different in character from men's conversation, appropriate for delicate drawing rooms rather than dining rooms thick with cigar smoke and port fumes. The withdrawal itself functioned as yet another test of social knowledge and proper training. Rising too early from your seat marked you as unfamiliar with proper timing and eager to escape. Rising too late was equally embarrassing and suggested you weren't paying proper attention to the hostess. You had to watch the hostess carefully for subtle preparatory cues and respond instantly when she finally rose. This particular practice continued remarkably well into the 20th century at formal occasions. The positive spin on this arrangement would be that it gave women dedicated space for their own conversations without any male presence or interference. The negative is painfully obvious. Women were systematically excluded from the discussions that actually shaped business and politics in Victorian society, a pattern reinforced through this nightly social ritual at dinner parties across the country. Women left the dining room, but nobody left the house. Victorian etiquette trapped all guests for hours after the meal concluded. Guests were required to stay for hours after the meal ended. Leaving immediately after dinner concluded was considered deeply offensive and insulting to your hosts. Victorian etiquette absolutely required guests to linger for an extended visit after the food was finished. One authoritative source states explicitly that no one may politely depart until at least 1 hour has passed after the meal ends. In actual practice, guests typically remained for 2 to 3 full hours after the final course was cleared, sometimes even longer. The reasoning behind this requirement was that leaving quickly after eating suggested you came only for the free food, not for the pleasure of the company. Hasty departure gave what sources call a bad compliment to the hostess, implying her conversation and social company simply weren't worth your valuable time once your stomach was full. Knowing when to finally leave was almost as complicated as knowing how to behave during the meal itself. The senior female guest present would eventually make subtle preparations to depart, and other guests would follow her lead in roughly the same order they'd arrived. The hostess herself gave carefully calibrated signals when she was finally ready for guests to leave, calling for coats to be brought, shifting her position toward the door, making comments about the late hour. Reading these signals correctly required considerable social experience. Missing them meant you might overstay your welcome badly, which could easily prevent any future invitations to that household. The positive aspect of this requirement is that it ensured genuine extended socializing rather than quick transactional meals where guests arrived, ate rapidly, and departed. Dinner parties became full evening events rather than mere feeding opportunities. The negative is the genuinely exhausting length of these evenings for everyone involved. A Victorian dinner party could easily consume an entire evening from early preparation through final departure. Between arrival timing, the elaborate multi-course meal itself, the post-dinner gender separation, and the required hours of lingering afterward, guests might spend 5 or 6 hours at a single event. Staying for hours was exhausting enough, but the single most choreographed moment of the entire evening came at that precise instant when women rose to leave the dining room. Gentlemen had to stand until every single woman left the room. The most elaborately choreographed rule of all, saved for our final position. When women rose to withdraw from the dining room after the meal, all men present were required to stand immediately. They remained standing completely still until the very last lady had fully departed the room. Only after the final woman had crossed the threshold could the men finally sit back down and begin their port and cigars. This might initially sound like simple old-fashioned courtesy, but consider the actual choreography involved moment by moment. Women rose and departed in a specific order based on social rank and the hostess's initial signal. Men had to stand immediately when the first woman rose and remain rigidly standing throughout the entire procession of departing ladies, however long it took. Any man who sat down too soon, perhaps because he mistakenly thought the last woman had left or simply lost focus for a moment, marked himself immediately as discourteous and poorly trained. The cultural context behind this ritual combines elaborate gender performance with the highly ritualized public behavior that characterized all Victorian social occasions. Men demonstrated their respect for women through these visible physical gestures of deference and patience. Standing motionless while women departed proved they understood their proper ceremonial role in the ongoing social performance of dinner. But there's considerable irony embedded in this particular ritual when examined closely. The very respect being demonstrated so elaborately by standing preceded the complete exclusion of those same women from all subsequent conversation. Men stood ceremonially while women left, then immediately sat down to discuss all the substantive topics women weren't permitted to hear or participate in. The gesture of respect directly enabled the exclusion. The positive reading of this custom is genuine courtesy and respect expressed through sustained physical gesture and patient attention. The negative is the ultimately hollow nature of that superficial respect. Standing motionless for 2 minutes meant relatively little when the entire purpose of the ritual was excluding women from real discussion of business, politics, and other serious matters. Well, that's it for this video, but don't go anywhere because we've got plenty more heat for you. Just tap any of the cards on your screen right now and keep it locked.